Greetings, salutations, and welcome to the Kreeger cast. I'm your host, Patrick Kreeger, and I'm joined, once again, by no one. This is the first solo cast in a long while, and the first solo cast on the new microphone. And let's just get right into our after action. Today, I will be reviewing something a little different, and the reason I'm alone is I went to a play. I went to a play at Musical Theater West, which is a local music theater company out of Long Beach, California. They play over at the college, but they put on full-scale, like, Broadway-level production sort of things. So the musical we saw today was Bright Star, which is a relatively new musical. It was inspired in 2013 when a couple of musical writers were working on a bluegrass album that came out in 2013 called Love Has Come For You. It was Grammy Award winning at the time, which is interesting to say the least. It first showed in 2014 in San Diego, and it took until 2016 to make its way to Broadway. And I believe it was in 2016 when they did a professional recording of the music from the show and ended up getting a nomination for Best Musical Theater Album for 2017, which is pretty cool. The music in it was definitely great, and I think that's one of its highlights. So, we'll start with the traditional watch, don't watch. Of the musicals I've seen the last few years, I think this one was the best, so it's definitely a watch, at least in my opinion. Musical Theater West always puts on great plays, and I do think that this play is going places, as it's basically a cheap gut shot, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that cheap gut shot, it does very well, and deservingly so. So let's start with how the play is done. The play is set in two time periods. It's set in 1923 as well as 1945-46. We open on a character singing about her life and how she's gone through many great moments and many not so great moments, and that she thought the story of her life was, one that was interesting and worth talking about. As she said, if you knew my tale, then you would have a tale to tell. We then cut to a young man returning home from the war and learning that, unfortunately, his mother had passed, and that, fortunately, one of the women from his hometown has grown very fond of him. So that was, kind of a double gut punch there, as in, he didn't really pick up on the girl's signals because he just found out his mother had died, which is unfortunate, to say the least. The set was really cool. They did this brickwork to fence in the three sides of the stage that looked like real brickwork. I don't know how they did it, but that was really impressive. Especially later when they were doing outdoor mountain scenes, they removed parts of the brickwork to make it look like it was a mountain range as opposed to a brick wall. I thought that was pretty cool. They had a little log cabin on stage, and the little log cabin on stage plays a central role because it's our main character's home, if you want to consider him a main character. The plot really does revolve around four different people, so it's kind of hard to pick a protagonist, though it's probably, based on what I can tell, it's probably the main woman who was singing, if you knew the story of my life, then you'd have a story to tell. The set, in addition to this little log cabin, had train tracks, and a train plays a pivotal role in the story, and these train tracks that they have on the set are really, really cute. They're this big archway with the little train tracks on top of it, and an actual little train puffing little smoke, like a G-scale model train, went across the stage up on high, so that was kind of cute. And as the trains travel, you see the little train going back and forth, and I thought that was pretty cool. Something I noticed while I was watching the play that it turned out was definitely the case. I felt like one of the songs early on in the play was good enough for radio. I think the song was titled Whoa Mama, It just seems like if you change the accompaniment a little bit and give it a little bit more, you could definitely see that song being played on the radio on modern country music stations. And so I thought that was kind of cool. The music was pretty great in that respect. A couple neat features of the show: as most live action stage plays, they had a little bit of artificial smoke on the set, which always makes the lighting look beautiful. But I think that the lighting artists, the lighting people, technicians, I guess, really did a great job on this particular play with the way they did the spotlights and the backlighting, and they just did a very nice job of that, creating nice cones of light around the characters. The lighting was just particularly beautiful this time. And to the audio engineer's credit, this particular play went off nearly flawlessly from an audio engineering standpoint. We had one issue in the first act. Well, yeah, in the first act, where our protagonist's boyfriend becomes excited over some news he hears and hugs her, and in the process of hugging her, kind of messed up his mic just a little bit. But other than that very minor flub, the audio engineering went off without a hitch. The acting I thought was pretty good. The singing was great. All the singers were clear and legible, and pretty good on that respect. As for the dancing, there wasn't very much dancing in this particular musical. So if you go to see dancing, this probably isn't 100% your play, though I would still recommend going and seeing it. However, it's clear that the cast, the ensemble, was very good at it, as they kept in time and didn't seem to make any noticeable mistakes during the few dancing segments they had. But they also had a lot of background singing and body music, like stamping on hands and feet and keeping time that way, because it is kind of supposed to be like a backwoods southern kind of country bluegrassy feel. And so there's lots of like body drumming and stuff like that they did pretty good at. So those are the things. I also thought that their use of props was pretty awesome, because this particular play had no sets, which I thought was a really interesting thing. Instead of doing like kind of cheap thrown together sets, because I don't assume they had too much time to build sets for this film or play, they went with the route of using really nice high quality props to build the scene. So like the bookstore had several bookshelves and a teller station. The bar had an actual bar brought in. You don't need 3 walls to make a room for a play. If you have the proper accoutrement, you can make the set out of the props. And I thought that was really cool. Particularly in the bar scene, I thought that was phrased real well. One thing that's kind of interesting, though, is remember that log cabin sort of thing that I mentioned at the beginning? That log cabin was a set for like a bluegrass band that was on stage. They had, a fiddler, a bassist, a pianist, a guitarist, right there on stage in this little building. And they moved the building around, and the people, the actors and actresses would go through the building. All the while there was live music coming from it, as well as from the pit. Give the pit musicians their due. But the big thing was being able to see those musicians live on stage as their set was moving around, and I thought that was kind of cool. So now that you got a rough idea of how this play was done, let's talk about the plot a little bit. Like I said, the plot starts in well, actually, we don't know when the plot starts, because the woman says, this is the story of my life. But the story really gets rolling when our second leading man, as it were, comes back from war and finds out, like I said, his mother has died. They make a few jokes about, like, oh, she wouldn't have wanted a angel on her tombstone. She always thought that was funny, that her acts are what she wanted to be known for more than, any other remembrance. And that comes back around later in the play, so we'll talk about that in a moment. We find out that the girl he left behind, who he left behind as a friend, now views him as more than that, which is, good for a returning soldier as such. But he really wants to become a well-known author. He had been writing short stories while he was off at war, and this girl back at home was editing them and making them more presentable and submitting them to places. And he even talks about how, he got an article in Stars and Stripes, which was pretty cool, especially at the time. And so he says, I'm going to go make it in the big city. And this woman who's infatuated with him had typed up all of his stories, had edited them, and had printed them up in nice, portfolio style submissions. And he goes to the big city, which I kept wanting to say was Nashville, but was apparently Asheville, which I'm going to sound like a real dunce when it comes to Tennessee geography, but I've never heard of Asheville until this time. If that's the case, I doubt they were mispronouncing Nashville that many times. So he goes to the big city, and he brings these papers with him, and he tries to submit them to the publishing house. And the publishing house front desk people say, no, we're not even going to look at it. We won't even let our head editor see it, because we're sure this is trash. And the head editor comes out and, of course, looks over some of his stuff, and he lies to her about, I have a letter of recommendation from so-and-so. And she goes, okay, that's very hard to get. Okay, I'll take your papers. And she reads them, and she calls him back in and says, these are trash, and how interesting that you got this letter from this guy. Tell me about it. And so he talks about how he got the letter, and she goes, cool, he's been dead for 7 years, so there's no way you got that letter. And he goes, oh. And she goes, sometimes, liars tell good stories, so I'll buy this story from you, but the rest are junk, go keep working. And then we start having flashbacks to this woman's childhood. Well, not childhood, but when she was a young woman. And she falls in love with a young man in town, and they end up having a kid together. The man in town is the son of the mayor, and the mayor wants a specific life for him. He doesn't not want that life. He just doesn't think that arranged marriages are necessarily the way to go to get it. As he says, why am I marrying a woman just for her trucks? And so that's kind of funny, that line. But the father says, trust me, I'll make sure we do what's necessary to preserve our family, as it were. Which is ironic, based on what he does later. So, our leading lady, the woman we saw at the beginning of the play, as well as the head of the publishing house, ends up getting pregnant by the son of the mayor, and they have a little boy. And so the father, the mayor, or the father of the father, the mayor, says, I'm going to protect my son. I'm going to go give this child up to an adoption agency in Raleigh. And he gets the mother's father to approve of it because she's underage, and steals the kid, puts the kid in a piece of luggage, and throws him out of a train. So only the father knows that he killed the kid. And that's where our play goes into intermission. Now, at this point, based on the jumping back and forth, it's clear that the kid didn't die. Every member of the audience knew that that kid was not dead. Or so we at least hoped. So, it's really a cool, from a live-action play perspective, concept. You're left on this cliffhanger of, you're 99% certain that that kid's okay. You're actually pretty certain that the kid is our second male protagonist. However, you really want to see it play out. You really do. So we go back in after intermission, after halftime and all that. And it's a scene between we have this scene with the father and the mayor. The leading man and the mayor. Where the mayor gets drunk and we find out he has, I think, jaundice. He says liver disease, but he's been turning yellow, apparently. And he reveals to his son that he murdered his son's child, his grandson. And I just found that kind of interesting because he talks about, oh, you know, I'm going to be preserving the family. I'm going to be preserving the family. And he does that by murdering his own grandson, which is really, really weird when you think about it. Like, okay, I get it. Like, you know, you don't want the stain of, you know, a child born out of wedlock, but there's a very easy solution to that, which is just let your son marry the girl. Yeah, sure, she's not the best girl for your business, but, you know, you get a grandson out of it. Your kid doesn't seem to mind business. He just doesn't want to marry for business. So I don't even know what was going on there. So instead he decides to murder his grandson, and okay, I guess. So the son has to debate now over, well, our leading man has to debate whether or not he tells his lady love that their son is dead. And he decides that he will never see her again, because it's better for her to have hope than to have her hopes dashed and be told that her son is dead. And we then flash forward, you know, because again, we've been flashing back and forth, you know, between our second leading man trying to get his papers published and our leading woman's era of this, you know, illicit love affair and child being born out of wedlock. We fast forward to the day when our second leading man gets his first story published. And he decides to go home and tell all of his family and friends that he's getting a story published. And at the same time, our leading lady is headed back to try to track down her long-lost son, which at this point she doesn't know is dead. Or at least presumed dead, based on what we've seen earlier in the play. And so they go back, and she checks the records, and no child has ever shown up in Raleigh. That on that date that matches that description. No, there was no child that showed up. And she kept talking about, you know, oh, this little blue sweater I wove for him. I know he was in a little blue sweater. And so eventually she says, hey, has anyone else been looking for this kid? And the record keeper woman says, no, I've been working here for 19 years, and no one has been looking for that child. So she's like, why didn't the guy why didn't the kid's father go and look for him? Like, you know, I thought he would. Well, it's because the kid's father knows he's dead, so why would he go looking for him? So she goes to the man's house because they happen to be in the same area, and she says, hey, why haven't you gone and looked for our kid? Why haven't you talked to me? And also, why haven't you been married? Which I thought was interesting. And, you know, he says, well, I've noticed you haven't been married either. And then he says to her, yeah, our kid's dead. So she goes back to her home and talks to her father. And her father, who forced her to give away her kid, doesn't beg for forgiveness, but profusely apologizes, knowing that what he did was unforgivable, but that he did it with their best interests in mind, and that he was naive at the time to give away the child. And so she tells him, don't worry, the child had a good life. And that's like a real tear-jerking scene. I'm not going to lie that this particular play was pretty emotional. I got close to crying a few times, even though I basically knew how this thing was going. Now, she goes to see where our second leading man, the guy who wrote the story she's publishing, grew up. She wants to meet his family and see where all these stories are from. And so when they go to meet the boy's father's packing him a bag so he can bring back with him to Asheville. And she sees the suitcase that her little boy was taken from her in. And then he finds in the suitcase, of course, a little blue sweater that he says was his baby sweater. And then she breaks down going, oh my God, you're my kid. And at which point the father says, well, actually she says, oh my God, to the boy's father, you're the one with the story to tell, not your kid. And so right as it's starting to get very emotional and people are starting to tear up, the father goes into this phrase, well, I was out one night, frog gigging. And of course, I I'm sure they threw that in there rather than like night fishing or anything like that, because just the phrase frog gigging is funny, and it kind of diffuses the emotional atmosphere, because this is supposed to be a happy moment, but just the way it comes off is it does come off as really bittersweet, because, you know, here's this kid that's loved these two people for 23 years of his life, and he's just now finding out that they're not actually his parents. I mean, my God, he just found out his mother was dead, and now he's finding out she wasn't even his mother. And so, like, you know, yeah, okay, it's a happy moment, but there's a lot of bitterness in that moment. And so the kid, so the father has to use that phrase frog gigging to kind of snap the audience out. And then there's a whole change of set and scenery by dimming the lights and throwing in some rocks, and, you know, there's a quick change in direction and momentum of the movement. Like, they needed to cut that off fast, and they did a really great job at that. And so the father is, you know, making all these cracks about, you know, I want a big fat frog for dinner tonight, and yada, yada, yada. And then a train goes by, kid falls from the train, and he goes, oh, my little baby Moses, because, you know, the whole Moses and the reeds thing. And he takes him home, and he raises him as his own. With the help of his wife. And I just thought that was really cool, because remember what the kid said earlier, the mother wanted to be remembered for her deeds, and one good deed she did, probably the hardest thing she did as a good deed, was to raise this kid that wasn't even hers and to treat him like her own. And that was really cool of her. So, although they do write it off like, oh, if someone threw you from the train, they clearly didn't want you. Like, okay, you know, you can't assume that, but, you know, whatever, different times. And so, you know, he finds out this woman's his mother. He runs off. She then goes and tells, our leading lady then goes and tells the son of the mayor and says, like, oh, our son's alive. And we get the nice, happy ending that we all see coming. Our leading lady marries her love of the past 23 years. Our secondary leading man marries the woman who's been helping him edit. And they even make the joke at the end of the receptionist and the secretary say, and we're getting married too. No, we're not, but wouldn't that be nice? And that was just funny, because it's funny, you know? It's a very light-hearted play, except for the couple moments where it gets emotional, but everyone knows where the play is going. Like I said, it's not a very complex plot, but it's really nice to see that actually play out the way you hope it will. One thing I do want to point out that was kind of funny about my particular theater-going experience was we have 3 moments where we see the child die or hear the child talked about having died. So we have the scene where the grandfather, the mayor of the town, throws the child from the back of a moving train. So that's pretty clearly him killing the kid. Then we see later on the son talking about and talking to his father about how, or the mayor, you know, the mayor and his kid are talking about how the mayor killed the kid. And then on the 3rd time, when the mayor's son has to tell our leading lady our son is dead, when he does that, this is the 3rd time, the 3rd clear time. Remember, the first 2 times, there were songs sung about child murder. The woman behind me audibly gasped, "Oh my God." And that was just really funny. Like, really, lady, you know, here we are, you know, an hour and a half into this play, and you're just now realizing that the kid's dead. We had a whole intermission. And again, the kid's not actually dead. You know, anyone who was paying attention knew it. That's where the writing was going. But it was still funny to see that. And there were actually quite a few wet eyes in the audience. Like I said, this was a pretty emotional film. Again, you know where it's going. It has a happy ending. But it's just emotional, because you can kind of put yourself in any of these people's shoes, and it's such like a realistic situation, especially again at the time that it's set between 1923 and 1946, you know, depending on the era we're in the story. So if you have a chance to see Bright Star, I would definitely recommend going and checking it out. Like I said, I got to see it through Musical Theater West, and Musical Theater West does great productions. I do find that they often have a little bit of a hard time with their audio. They always have great lighting. They always have great sets. They always have great costumes. Sometimes their wig work and makeup needs a little bit of effort. This was not one of those times. My only major complaint would be that probably 1 out of 3 plays, they have a serious audio flub where, like, you can't hear the actors and actresses sing over the instruments, which I find unfortunate, especially when a lot of these musicals use music to convey the story. So if you can't hear the words, it's an issue. That being said, their plays are fairly cheap to see. They were saying that it was something like $80 for the season, which includes 4 plays. They often will have an additional 5th play that's never part of the season pass. And it's definitely worth, if you like musical theater, Musical Theater West is one of the better ones, and I would recommend that you go and check them out and support your local theater. Anyway, until next time, dear listener, see you out there.